Hello and welcome to Mark's Woodworking Challenges. I'm Mark, your host, and today we have a hand tool challenge. We're going to be chopping by hand some mortises. Now before we begin, I want to make perfectly clear that I am probably not the world's expert on hand chopping mortises. Like a lot of you out there, I suspect, I do it no more than half a dozen times a year, probably, and in a lot of years, probably 2 times. However, it's not a very difficult process, and once you've got the basic procedure down, it's not too hard to pick it up again, even if it's several months later. So I recently chopped some mortises by hand. I'm making a piece of furniture, and this is it. This is the legs. It's sort of a mid-century modern kind of design, and in a fit of irrational exuberance, I decided to angle out the legs. I did that. That's both on the front end, which is here, as well as even the back end is angled a bit. And so there are no right angles in this piece of furniture. And so basically, even if you were in the habit of machining mortises, once you've got mortises that are not at a right angle, it probably means that it's a little bit easier to do it by hand. If you've got a small number of mortises and there's something particularly difficult about it, then you should probably consider doing it by hand. If you've got to do, 88 mortises for all the cabinets in your kitchen, well, you should really set up a machine to do it. But in this case, I had 4, 2 in each leg, one here and one here. So it made a lot of sense, I think, to do it by hand. There's basically about 4 steps to hand chopping a mortise. First, you have to lay out the mortise. That's certainly that's where you begin. Second, you're going to consider your strategies for hand chopping the mortise. Third, mortising is a semi-violent act, and so you need to secure it to the bench top very well, and we're going to go through the right way, or at least one way of doing that. And then lastly, you pick up your chisel and chop the mortise. So let's get to it. Let's look a little bit at the tools. We've got a Mortise Gauge. This one happens to be a Japanese style Mortise Gauge. It has these knife type edges here. I like this kind of mortise gauge quite a bit for 2 reasons. One is these happen to be really easy to sharpen, so I can get a fairly magnificent edge on them. And secondly, it is indeed a knife type action, and in a minute we're going to see why that's a good thing when we start chopping our mortise. So other tools that we're going to be using: Mortise Chisels, 3/8. We have the Mortise Gauge set out to be exactly the same width as the chisel. Actually, I can see we're going to adjust that a little bit and before we start. It's pretty close. Maybe that's all right. Going to check that. Always check that. I actually have a second one that is just a hair smaller than the one I use, which is actually kind of nice for digging out chips. Square, depth gauge, mallet, and a big cheap square. We'll see why we need that in a minute. Okay, here's the workpiece. If this is the real workpiece that you're going to be chopping a mortise in, and it's going to end up in your piece of furniture, we can assume that you have marked the face and the true edge. The true edge being perfectly perpendicular to the face. All the measurements, if possible, should reference off of one of those two edges. Alright, so here's our mortise gauge. It is set to exactly the width of our chisel, and it is as close as I can make it. So we're going to knife the two lines in there like that. Now, the reason that the face is so important is, as long as you always make your marks relative to that face, it doesn't matter if it's 100% perfectly in the middle. I mean, I've gotten it pretty close, and I always try to get it pretty close, but it's hard to get it like to the nearest 1/100th of a millimeter. But if you're in the middle and you're always measuring relative to the face, all the mortises are going to come out the same distance from the face, and everything will look fine in the end. Okay, next thing we're going to do is maybe fairly trivial, but we're going to mark the ends of the mortise. We're going to make this a typical mortise length, say, let's go for 1 1/4 inches. Okay, that is where the mortise is going to end up. Let's go to the next step. Okay, the second part is securing the workpiece to the bench. Now, what you can see here is I have a board clamped in the leg vise. There is, of course, a leg behind the leg vise. And then I have the workpiece clamped to this board. So when I'm chopping the mortise, I'm actually, there's a substantial amount of downward force which is going to be into the bench directly over the leg. You don't want to clamp it in the vise and then chop the mortise, especially if it's not a leg vise. A leg vise would probably be maybe okay, but if you had it in a tail vise or shoulder vise, you would be putting a tremendous amount of downward force on the vise, and you would be probably having the potential to damage that vise. So this is going into the bench, the force into the bench directly over the leg. It's also securely clamped. The board is clamped in the leg vise. The workpiece is clamped to the board with two reasonably stout C-clamps. And there's a lot of force in these two directions as well, not just down, but also parallel to the workpiece, because your chisel is in some cases going to be going in at an angle, and that is going to be, you're going to definitely want the workpiece to not slide on you while you're chopping the mortise. Another thing to keep in mind is you should check that the workpiece is square to the bench. In fact, let's just come over here a little bit. And it's really good. My bench is pretty decent as far as squareness goes, and so this is a place that people probably don't pay enough, maybe don't pay enough attention to, and that because you want to be chopping straight up and down. You don't want to have to angle the chisel while you're chopping to account for a workpiece that's not straight. In fact, to make sure that the chisel is straight, we're going to take this cheap plastic square and put it down here, and the bench is going to vibrate some, so we're going to try to make sure that we're going to try to make sure that it doesn't fall over, but it's a cheap plastic square, so if it does, who cares? So that when I'm chopping the mortise, I'm orienting the chisel, I'm sighting to make sure that the chisel is parallel to that square. Okay, now there's basically a couple of different strategies that one can use to chop out the mortise. Let's say that this is the mortise. So I'm just going to put vertical lines here. These will be the ends of the mortise. And we want the mortise to be 1 inch deep. So one strategy is to start in the middle, chop that way, pry out the chip, and basically make V cuts until you get down to the bottom, and then start bringing the ends, start paring off the ends with the mortise chisel until you get to the ends of the mortise. The second strategy, now we're going to make a little bit bigger mortise here. The second strategy is to basically take out chips in layers like that, then turn around and do that, then turn around and do that, and keep going until you get to the bottom of the mortise, and then at the very last thing, true up the ends. I find that works pretty good for big mortises, a little hard to do with small mortises, whereas this one, the V strategy, works a little better with small mortises. So let's, I think we're at about the point where we can start chopping. Okay, we've clamped our workpiece down and we've made sure it's square to the table, and we're ready to start chopping the mortise. So when we're chopping the mortise, we want to be focused on holding the chisel straight up and down, as I just said. We don't want to be focused on making sure it doesn't move side to side like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a shallow mortise first. we're going to take the knife lines, and this is why I like the knife lines. We're going to chisel in like that a little bit. Then we're going to take our Mortise chisel and because we've made a sort of a barrier, we've made a boundary with the knife line, and we're chiseling just a shallow, you know, 1/8 of an inch deep. And that's about got it. And so what you can see is that basically constrains the chisel within the mortise area. Okay, so really then, when we're chopping the mortise, I'm standing back here, I'm looking down at my square down at midway down the bench, and all I have to do is start pounding. Okay, here's the finished product. As you can see, it's a fairly nice rectangle. It's going to be hard to see on camera. You know, I don't know how to light up the inside of that mortise. It is fairly, as we already saw, that it was full depth all the way up and down, and the bottom is reasonably flat. Doesn't have to be perfectly flat. I can see that on this side here is nice and straight. I did wallow out just a hair on this side, so there's some room for improvement on the next time, but it is not bad, frankly. It would be happy to receive any tenon that you make. So I'm going to give myself let's say a B, maybe a B minus, but I think it's a solid B. Needs some work to get to the A category, but like I say, I do this not very often each year, and so I'm pretty happy with a B. Before we wrap it up, I did want to come back for just a minute to the subject of tools, and specifically the Mortise Chisel. You have just seen that the Mortise Chisel is pounded straight into the wood and used as a pry bar to get chips out. Basically, it suffers a lot of abuse. And so that's why the Mortise Chisels are built in a very stout fashion. You can see how thick the blade is there, and including the handle where it joins the handle and so forth. Likewise, same here for the smaller one. They're all the same. There are different types out there, but they pretty much all share that characteristic. It needs to be that heavy duty in order to take that abuse. If you try to use something like this, you have a high probability of breaking it in two when you try to pry the chips out. So if you're going to chop mortises, it's highly recommended that you get an actual Mortise chisel. Okay then, there's not much else to say about hand chopping a mortise. As you can see, it came out fine. Like I say, I gave myself a B. I think that's fair. Those, you know, feel free to disagree in the comments section. But you know, I don't do this very often, and I guess my message to you is, if I can do it, you can do it. Okay, that about wraps it up for this time. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave comments and questions in the comments section. Hit the like button, or by all means subscribe. And without further ado, we'll see you next time on Mark's Woodworking Challenges.